How did Rome conquer the world? Nope. It wasn't just a matter of luck and blessings. Behind the empire's expansionary tendencies lay the powerful Roman legions, who were ready to fight the big war at any given time. Join us as we unravel the 20 amazing facts about the greatest strength of the ancient Roman Empire. Number 20. Formation and structure of the Roman legions. In Rome, the strength hardly ever lay in numbers. The Roman legions had a cohesive and strict organizational structure that gave them an edge over uncountable wars that the empire had picked for them. Each soldier knew his place, and even in times of chaos and disruption, they were tactically aware of their job and responsibility. While the fighting strength could vary, generally, a legion had 4,800 soldiers, 60 centurions, 300 artillerymen, 100 engineers and artificers, and 1,200 combatants. Plus, each legion had its unit of the equites, the 300 cavalries that were equally brutal and powerful. That's not all. Legions were also known to recruit archers and slingers of their own, who mostly came from the provinces and local tribes. These numbers might vary from source to source because even classical Roman literature never gave us any clear answers. The formation of the legions might have changed from time to time, considering the empire's warmongering tendencies. This highly disciplined unit was commanded by a legate, a senator who had been in the position of a praetor too. Under his command were 6 staff officers, including a senior military tribune and the legate's right-hand man, and 5 other staff members from the equestrian class. The centurion was another sought-out and prestigious position, which was the true benchmark of struggle and hard work. A centurion had always risen in the ranks and was responsible for leading and disciplining the army. To be a legionary in Rome was an honor of the utmost kind. These individuals would serve their people for 25 years or more, after which they were discharged. In that case, they were free to live in a military colonia with their fellow legionaries or return home. Number 19. Roman weapons and arms. Other than being highly disciplined and well-trained, the Roman legions held their ground during a war because of their sophisticated weapons and armor. Basically, a Roman soldier was a heavily armored spearman who had metallic shrouded protection from his enemies. A soldier would use a shield measuring 3 feet in diameter, which was set in place using a strap and the hand grip. Their heads and faces were covered by a bronze helmet. A bronze cuirass protected their chest, and they also used greaves for the lower legs. Yet it was their weaponry that won them wars and territories. While it's true that the Roman arms evolved and changed throughout the age of the empire, certain favorites always made the cut. Thanks to the movies, you can probably guess these quintessential weapons. They included spears, swords, and javelins. Surprisingly, Romans didn't rely on archery much, so crossbows weren't the most popular weapons for the legions. The soldiers were keen on keeping not 1 but 2 swords, the mighty gladius and spatha. Yet it was the pugio, or the iconic dagger, that would become the most famous Roman weapon in the modern world. After all, it is the same dagger that was used in the murder of Julius Caesar. Number 18. The hefty discipline and training. Ever wondered how Rome had conjured up the most highly effective army of its time? Well, their training regime might tell us why. While the Roman legions only trained for 4 months at best, their exercises were physically and emotionally demanding. The first thing they learned was marching, but it wasn't solely about moving feet left and right. Roman soldiers were instructed to march for 30 kilometers in 5 hours, carrying 45 pounds of equipment. After marching came the ultimate test of physical fitness. The soldiers were engaged in multiple physically demanding exercises, including running, jumping, and weight training, to build the endurance, strength, and agility needed for prolonged warfare. Multiple legions also built their swimming prowess, especially in the summers. The next stage was perhaps the most critical one: weapons training. This is where the training regime got even tougher and physically demanding. You see, the training utilized wickerwork shields and wooden swords, intentionally designed to be twice as heavy as their actual combat counterparts. Roman commanders, who were in charge of the training, believed that mastery over these heavier weapons would make the soldiers more effective with their usual weapons, especially in a prolonged case of warfare. Don't worry, though. The legions only moved on to the next stage of the training after they had shown proficiency with wooden weapons. Only then were they allowed to take part in armatura, the individual drills. Eventually, they took part in collective spars, too. These spars were friendly for sure, but sometimes things went out of hand, too. Perhaps this is why Roman legions were known to show no mercy on the ground. No wonder they won significant laurels for their commanders, who took pride in their excessive training regimes. Number 17. Cunning tactical innovations. Roman soldiers were the masters of formation. Thanks to their military drills, they knew each position and structure at their fingertips. As soon as their commander belted out the command, they would assume the position immediately. Unsurprisingly, Romans had come up with these formations by themselves to increase the proficiency of their war-honing techniques. Perhaps the most popular formation was the testudo, or the tortoise, where legions formed a 360-degree wall of wood using their large scuta, or shields. The front rank of the tortoise used to kneel behind their co-joined shields, while the second rank held their shield above the heads of the men in the front. This series of arrangements would go on. Now, we know what you're thinking. This sort of formation would make marching on an active battlefield pretty inconvenient. And well, that's where the tactic got its name from. This is why legions only employed the tactic in response to distant missile fire. Particularly, testudo was deployed during sieges to give engineers and troops safe access to the walls that were important to destroy. To make semi-permanent defensive structures, this trick was helpful too. Other formations included the infamous wedge, where the point of the structure consisted of Rome's best and most highly effective troops. This point, or the center, was pretty lethal in its task. As the sides of the wedge protected their best legions, the point charged onto their enemy with no mercy. The wedge allowed the Romans to concentrate their power to deliver a single brutal blow to their enemies that was compressed into a smaller space. Pretty ingenious and effective. Number 16. Daily activities of a Roman legion. It's hard to conceptualize that Roman soldiers used to get their well-deserved break from sieging cities and enticing violence against their enemies. Now, that doesn't mean that legions were vacationing or spending time with their families. Their typical day consisted of doing military drills and serving the empire by helping civilians or patrolling the borders. At the same time, many soldiers would take up engineering projects or help their fellow soldiers to acquire skills like archery. Legions would wake up at the crack of dawn, and their first task of the day was the daily mandatory inspection. Yep, Roman commanders would take a head count every day and make sure that the legions were taking care of their weapons. If their arms or tools weren't cleaned, polished, or had some sort of breakage, the soldiers were punished accordingly. After a short meal, their day would start with endurance drills, marching, and clanging of their swords. New recruits would have morale-building exercises to learn the tenets of unity, friendship, and discipline. There was no going home either. Each legion had a career of 25 years, during which they would be away from their families. Roman commanders used that emotional break to their advantage. Soldiers were taught to see their fellow military men as their family, whom they had to protect on the battlefield. This is why soldiers had their meals together, which consisted of bread, meats, olive oil, and sour wine. No wonder legions took an afternoon break after having a hearty meal. After sunset, the soldiers would retreat to their tents where they indulged in leisure activities. Number 15. Masterful Roman engineering. Roman soldiers were not only the masterminds of using weaponry and instilling war tactics, they were effective engineers too. There's no doubt that the vast Roman Empire boasted some engineering wonders of its time. It had excellent connectivity with roads, highways, and bridges that made communication and travel highly convenient. Believe it or not, it was the Roman Legionary that was at the back end of such marvelous infrastructure. Now, you know why all roads lead to Rome. The Roman administration made sure to pay highly skilled craftsmen and soldiers some extra pennies. This is why legions were incentivized to build their skill set. They also hoped that once they retired and returned to their homes, they'd be able to get architecture jobs. Roman commanders saw architecture as an essential skill to hone. Since the armies were always fighting a war or two, They would run into areas that had sparse to no commute systems. For instance, Julius Caesar famously built a wooden bridge to cross the Rhine with his legions. The German tribes hadn't seen him coming. He stormed into their territory, attacked them, and destroyed the bridge so no one could find their way to his soldiers. At the same time, the soldiers were polished military engineers too. One glimpse of the Roman fortification and siege tactics will show you how handy legions were with building devices of war. They used to build entire towns and cities around the enemy lines, and they didn't leave the area until their opponents were either executed or raised a white flag. Number 14. Breaking the siege. History books are filled with the greatest tales of the iconic Roman war tactic, the siege of a city until they win the territory either by force or diplomacy. The way Roman wars would pan out, it was mostly the latter. Romans had indeed borrowed the idea of siege warfare from the Greeks, yet the ancient empire made sure to perfect the art. For the empire's expansion through the Mediterranean, siege warfare had come in pretty handy. While the Roman commanders preferred pitched battles, fortifying defense was used heavily too. This is the time when the army had understood one of the basic tenets of war. Sometimes wars are won solely by morally weakening your enemy. This is why Romans sieged their enemies in a way that there was no way out or in. Besieged cities mostly ran out of food supplies and were forced to give up or fight a losing battle. If forced starvation didn't work, legions planned brutal and decisive surprise attacks on their enemies. Cities that were already running low on food supplies would be forced to use all of their resources on a short-lived skirmish. At the heart of any siege was a massive frontal attack, though. Roman legions would build siege towers and rams to break into the cities and employ heavy artillery at them. Historians also give Romans credit for masterfully teaching the world how to fortify their cities almost perfectly. It was the efficient Roman fortification that eventually defeated the great general, Hannibal. During the Second Punic War, Rome had faced significant losses at the hand of Carthage, but eventually, it was the break of the siege that took down Hannibal's ambition. Number 13. Legionary rewards and retirement. There was a time when the Roman army only recruited the upper-class members of the empire, who either had the power of money or family legacy on their side. As the empire expanded and made several enemies, the military faction needed a mass induction of new soldiers. This is when the Roman military expanded its horizons and turned legions into career soldiers who wanted to earn enough money to afford social mobility. The most lucrative part of serving in the legion was the promise of Roman citizenship for the soldiers, and sometimes their descendants too. For soldiers who weren't native to the land, military service was the quickest pathway to earn citizenship. The minimum time of service was 25 years, after which a legion would become a Roman citizen. Earning citizenship meant that one was able to get social and legal privileges, such as the right to vote, the right to marry, buy property, and contest in assemblies, among others. Not to mention, Roman soldiers were pretty well paid. Sources suggest that their income was 3 times more than the average yearly income of most citizens in the empire. Plus, aware of the struggle and hard work soldiers had to put in for the empire's expansionary business, many rulers and monarchs increased the wages too. The most notable increment in salaries came from Julius Caesar. Other than the money, legions were also gifted salt, which was a rare and valuable commodity at that time. There's more, though. Roman soldiers didn't have indecisive retirement plans either. The administration made sure to give them land, mostly in occupied territories where soldiers would work as farmers, craftsmen, engineers, and so on. All in all, soldiers led a pretty comfortable lifestyle. Number 12. The glorious legions. There's no doubt that Roman soldiers were well paid and well fed. However, their biggest reward was the glorious reputation that came with their heroic acts of service, either during a civil war for the winning faction or fighting external enemies. Romans kept the heroic stories of their legions alive to boost morale. One of the most popular legions in ancient Rome was Legion 9 Hispania, or the Hispana Legion. The legion was formed by Julius Caesar during his decisive campaign against the Roman Republic. Hispana had earned its well-deserved reputation after fighting valiantly alongside its compatriot legions during the invasion of Gaul in 58 BC. While the legion was Caesar's joy and pride, it was extremely useful to his heir Octavian too. It was the Hispana legion that was in charge of annexing the city of Sicily, which was under the control of the emperor's worst enemy, Sextus Pompeius. The legion's masterful tactics had won them the city, much to Octavian's joy. Number 11. The Fabri. We have talked about how Roman soldiers were remarkable engineers, craftsmen, and architects. However, as a basic way to optimize the efficiency of the army, each legion had its own squad of the very underrated group, the Fabri. This highly skilled group of engineers, sappers, and various kinds of craftsmen would travel with their legions to military campaigns and siege warfare. Since the Fabri weren't soldiers technically, their efforts and skills were largely ignored. This is why you'd hardly read about their craftsmanship in history books. While the members of the Fabri were forgotten or ignored, historians cite that the group was highly effective in the sieging efforts during the Punic Wars. In terms of fortifying the Roman legions and building machinery like rams and towers, the Fabri were at the forefront of military campaigns. Historical studies indicate that there were at least 120 groups of Fabri in the 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. So, how come we hardly ever get to hear about the Fabri? Well, it might have to do with Marian reforms. It is said that the Fabri units had little to no place in the standing Roman army. Marius preferred qualified legions to assist the individual infantry units, who ideally had a plethora of skills, including war-making and engineering. At the same time, some historians contest that the Fabri continued to exist under the leadership of their commander, Perfectus Fabrum. While this term might sound unfamiliar, one of the most known Perfectus Fabris was Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, who authored 10 books on architecture. So if anything, the Fabri were the masters of their craft. Their popularity also subsided because Marius insisted that his legions should have all the skills that were required for Rome's quintessential sieging tactics, including the art of building bridges. Eventually, the Fabri ceased to possess a unique set of skills for the Roman legions. Number 10. Connection with God. Roman religion had a special place in military camps too. Before fighting any major battle, the soldiers would offer their prayers and tributes to the Roman god of war, Mars. In fact, the daily routine of soldiers also had a deeply religious element. After their military exercise, soldiers took time out to offer their prayers. Number 9. Reforms within the Roman military. As the Roman Empire grew, its military organization evolved as well. In the Roman Republic and beyond, there was a mutual understanding that the organizational structures and the rule of law should have some utility for the new citizens and occupied territories. New people joined the military rapidly, so it made sense for leaders like Gaius Marius to reform the military to meet the demands of these soldiers. The most well-known set of reforms came from Marius himself, who brought 3 significant changes to the military in 107 BC. First, it was Marius who established Rome's first-ever standing army. Before this rule, Rome would enlist soldiers according to the requirements of the military campaigns. After the season was over, military regiments were dissolved. Marius knew that the rapid expansion of the empire meant more war campaigns, and hence, more enemies. The security of the people rested in the hands of a permanent and stable military faction. Since he was establishing Rome's army from scratch, Marius was able to change the organizational structure too. He chose to make the century the basic unit from which his legions were built. Second, Marius allowed the poor to enlist in the Roman army, which wasn't possible before. You see, Roman soldiers had previously been required to bring their own arms and armor to the battlefield. A poor person simply didn't have enough means to purchase their own weapons. Marius removed that rule, and in order to make this reform work, he also standardized the weapons that Roman soldiers used during wars. Marius's third initiative was wildly appreciated, and you'll see why. Marius was the one who gave legions their retirement plan. The idea of compensating soldiers with land at the end of their service was pretty foreign to the empire. Marius changed that for multiple reasons. Sure, he wanted to appreciate the soldiers for their hard work, But he also saw this reward as the ultimate way to incentivize people to join the military. Let's say the idea worked like a charm. Number 8. Specialized units of the Roman military. The military reforms made sure that Rome had a standing army to take down its enemies whenever required. However, the legions were pretty adaptive too. According to the strength and expertise of their enemies, the army deployed specialized units too. These experts had a skill set that wasn't very typical for Roman legions to possess. This sort of organizational structure made the legions super agile and dynamic. When they knew that their typical sword warfare would fall short, they employed cavalry against their opposition. At times, they would also hire siege engineers on a rolling basis. The empire was overly using siege tactics to expand its territory through the Mediterranean. This meant that the soldiers not only had to keep enemies at bay, but also spare time to build fortifications, bridges, ladders, towers, and so on. So, the Roman commanders would send hiring calls for siege engineers, architects, and craftsmen, who used their skills for civil pursuits to join the army to further harness their engineering prowess. Frequently, Roman legions hired archers too, who could unleash pain and anguish on their enemies from the mountains or while marching. The foot and mounted variants of the archers meant that Romans had all sorts of advantages over their enemies. This is when most militaries were one-trick ponies. It makes a lot of sense why most military campaigns went to Rome pretty quickly. Outside a battlefield, legions had special units for patrolling purposes too. These soldiers were pretty good at what they did, but at the same time, their limited skill set meant that they could make themselves useful for civilian purposes, such as protecting the borders from their enemies. Number 7. Lessons from defeat. Even if Roman legions were the best of the best, they still weren't invincible. However, a closer look at their worst defeat and excellent triumphs will tell you that they were constantly learning from their mistakes. Till the sad demise of the empire, Roman legions had opted for one clear strategy: always play on your strengths. When they wouldn't get an opportunity to showcase their strengths, they would create a window to do so. For example, take the Battle of Cannae, where Romans suffered a mass execution at the hands of the Carthage general, Hannibal. The general knew that his infantry couldn't overpower the Roman legions, so he took advantage of his cavalry, an area where the empire severely lacked. The Romans suffered a humiliating loss, but learned the most important lesson: to remain dynamic and flexible in the face of adversity. We don't have to tell you what happens next. When on-field battling didn't work for the Romans, they forced Hannibal to face the most challenging and brutal siege of ancient times. The legions knew that Hannibal wasn't as experienced in siege warfare, and ultimately, they were able to force Carthage out. Julius Caesar employed a similar tactic to win Gaul, after his legions couldn't withstand the heavy skirmishes around the city. Number 6. The Roman military doctrine. It's true that the Roman military never thought of building an official doctrine for its forces, but the way it operated serves important lessons for us today. Foremost, Roman legions heavily emphasized building strength through shared values. While their commanders put them through demanding drills and exercises, soldiers invested a lot in their disciplinary training as well. The legions knew that if they had to win a war, their weapons might fall short, but their endurance might not. Today, modern militaries operate under the same values of creating an unbreakable bond among their soldiers. In Rome, soldiers would see each other as brothers in arms. Such beliefs meant that legions would take their training seriously, as they were not only responsible for protecting themselves but their peers too. Number 5. The highly effective military infrastructure. Perhaps one of the most efficient military infrastructures in ancient Rome was the arms factories. Since the legions were not always at the forefront of development in the empire, the administration made sure that any infrastructure plan should serve the military in one way or another. This is why arm factories were positioned along the road, so the Roman armies would never run out of supplies like iron armor, swords, helmets, and javelins. The production of weapons and weapons engineers were very central to the military might of the empire. The factory workers were labeled as deterrents against desertion. Roads and highways were crucial to the success of the Roman military too. The administrators came up with an effective road system, so commanders could easily calculate their commute time from one place to another. For instance, the military knew that it would take them 67 days to get to Cologne from Rome. The developed road system also meant that the Roman military was everywhere, and the new citizens, whose loyalty would always be questionable, were always under the watchful gaze of the legions. Number 4. Marriage status. It might not shock you, but during the first 2 centuries AD, Roman soldiers were not allowed to marry. Their excessive training meant that their wives couldn't live with them, and they had to be away from home for 25 years at least. However, many veterans sought to get married and start a family. At the same time, historical sources talk about soldiers who had de facto unions with women and even fathered children. Sadly, the empire considered those children illegitimate, and they had little to no rights in the social and legal spheres. Plus, Roman men were free to enter into relationships with other men. So in many ways, soldiers didn't feel the need to marry until their retirement years. Number 3. Code of conduct. Perhaps the biggest crime for a Roman soldier was to abandon his peers or flee the battle scene. Once found, the soldier was beaten to death, often with stones by his peers, whose lives were endangered. Typically, commanders had the same punishments for the soldiers who would abuse their position or people under the command. Certain historical sources cite that stealing something from the military camp was punishable too. The Roman legion had strict punishments for so-called unmanly acts, which included showing fear or hesitance to execute the enemy. The punishment for this unspeakable act was collective and communal. Every 10th man from the selected lot was beaten to death for the crimes of one soldier. Even though the practice was abandoned, it was reinstated by Marcus Crassus. Number 2. The food logistics. The Roman legions were known to enjoy a feast or two. Since the number of legions grew, the Roman administration took important steps to ensure that the soldiers were always well fed. The army camps had linkages with farms and food factories that provided supplies like bread, biscuits, meats, and wine to the soldiers. For long military campaigns, legions were tasked to carry and ration their limited food supplies. Once they ran out of food and water, they would resort to their hunting and foraging skills to keep themselves alive. Number 1. Post-retirement life of the soldiers. It's safe to say that after living an arduous military life, the legions spent their retired years comfortably. Emperors like Augustus offered soldiers a retirement fund that was 13 times their annual pay. Other than a monetary bank, soldiers received a piece of farmland where they could grow their food or live with their families. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.